I'm Lyra, 28, a female, and my family is about to be shattered at my brother's wedding because they think my other brother, a Navy hero, is a disgrace. For years, I've been a silent witness to a family dynamic as rigid and unyielding as the foundations I design for a living. In our family, you were either a column, holding up the family name, or you were a crack in the plaster, a flaw to be covered up. My older brother, Blaine, was the main column. At 32, he was the firstborn, the golden child, an investment banker with a smile as polished as his Italian leather shoes. He was a reflection of our father, Grant, a man who had built a manufacturing empire from the ground up and believed that a person's worth could be calculated on a balance sheet. Success, in our home, was loud. It was the roar of a new sports car in the driveway, the clinking of champagne glasses at exclusive clubs, the heavy thud of an engraved plaque being placed on the mantelpiece. My other brother, Reese, was the crack in the plaster. At 30, he was the quiet storm, the middle child who never fit the mold our father had cast. Where Blaine was loud, Reese was silent. Where Blaine was polished, Reese was rugged. He didn't care for balance sheets or stock portfolios. He found his value in things you couldn't frame or deposit. A sunrise over a lake, the satisfaction of fixing a broken engine, the quiet loyalty of a friend. This difference made him an anomaly, and in our family, anomalies were treated as failures. In me, I was the archway caught between them. As an architect, I understood structure, balance, and the stress points that can bring a whole building down. For my entire life, I had tried to bridge the growing chasm between my brothers and my father to absorb the pressure and prevent a total collapse. I loved them all, but my loyalty was always torn, a quiet, aching split down my center. The favoritism wasn't subtle, it was the very architecture of our childhood. I remember one summer when Blaine, then 16, brought home a perfect report card. That weekend, a gleaming silver convertible with a giant red bow appeared in the driveway. My father clapped him on the back, his voice booming with pride for the whole neighborhood to hear. "That's my boy, a winner." 2 weeks later, Reese, who was 14, accidentally broke a small window in the garage while practicing baseball pitches. He'd spent the entire day meticulously cleaning up the glass and had saved up his allowance to pay for the repair. When he approached our father, money in hand and apology on his lips, there was no understanding. Grant's face hardened. Reese was grounded for the entire summer. "Responsibility, Reese," my father had said, his voice cold. "Blaine understands it." "You seem to think it's a game." I saw the flicker of hurt in Reese's eyes before he masked it with that familiar, stoic calm. Blaine got a car for succeeding, Reese got a punishment for trying. The defining fracture happened the evening Reese announced his plans after high school. We were at one of our tense family dinners, the air thick with unspoken expectations. Blaine was going on about his internship at a prestigious firm, and my father was soaking it in. Then, during a lull in the conversation, Reese cleared his throat. "I've decided what I'm going to do," he said, his voice steady. "I'm enlisting. I'm joining the Navy." Silence fell over the dining table. It was so absolute I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Blaine smirked into his napkin. My father placed his fork and knife down with a deliberate, metallic click. "The Navy," Grant's voice was laced with a disbelief that bordered on disgust. "Doing what? Swabbing decks? You have a brain, Reese. You have opportunities. Blaine is building a future. I built a company for you boys. And you want to throw it all away to be a grunt." "It's not throwing it away," Reese said, his jaw tight. "It's service, it's honorable." "Honorable," my father laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Honor doesn't pay the bills. Honor doesn't build an empire. Blaine gets it, why don't you?" From that day on, Reese was effectively exiled. He went to boot camp and his communication became sparse. He couldn't or wouldn't talk about what he did. His letters were brief, his calls even shorter. When we'd ask what his job was, he'd just say, "I work on the ships," or "I handle personnel movement." It was Blaine who coined the term that would come to define Reese within our family. After a particularly vague phone call from Reese, Blaine hung up the phone and laughed. "He's so secretive. For what? He's probably just a doorman on some big ship, checking IDs. A glorified security guard." The name stuck, the Navy Doorman. It was perfect for the narrative my father and Blaine had constructed. It was menial, unimpressive, and perfectly encapsulated their vision of Reese as the family disappointment. They used it with casual cruelty, a little inside Joe. Key at family gatherings where Reese wasn't present. And I, the silent archway, stood by and said nothing, convincing myself that causing a fight would only make things worse. I chose peace over truth, a decision that felt more and more like a betrayal with every passing year. Now Blaine was getting married. The wedding was set to be the social event of the year, a union of two powerful families. His fiancée, Alara, was a brilliant lawyer whose father was none other than Commander David Miller, a respected figure in the Navy. The irony was almost too much to bear. My family, who belittled the military, was about to merge with it. And Reese, the disgrace, was flying in for the occasion. The stress points were groaning. The foundation was about to crack. The week before the wedding felt like the tense calm before a thunderstorm. The air in my parents' house, where I was temporarily staying, was thick with a mixture of frantic energy and suffocating pride. My mother, a woman who had long ago learned to navigate my father's moods by becoming as quiet and unobtrusive as possible, floated through the rooms, double-checking flower arrangements and seating charts. My father, Grant, walked around as if he were the king of a realm preparing for its most important festival. Everything must be perfect, he'd declare at breakfast, pointing a finger for emphasis. Blaine and Alara deserve the best. This isn't just a wedding, it's a statement. It shows everyone what this family is about: success, strength, legacy. His eyes would always find me when he said this, a silent question in them. He knew I was the one who still spoke to Reese regularly, or as regularly as Reese's life allowed. "Has your other brother confirmed his attendance?" he asked me one afternoon, not even bothering to use Reese's name. The phrase "other brother" had become another one of his dismissive tools. "Yes, Dad, Reese is coming," I said, trying to keep my voice even. Grant grunted, staring out the window at the perfectly manicured lawn. "Good, it's important for Alara's family to see us all together, a united front." He turned to face me, his expression hardening slightly. "I trust he understands the importance of this event. No scenes. He needs to dress appropriately, act respectably. This is Blaine's day. I don't want Reese and his gloomy attitude casting a shadow over it." "Reese isn't gloomy, Dad. He's just quiet." "He's a disappointment, Lyra, and we both know it," he said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "An able-bodied young man with all the advantages in the world, and he chooses to be a whatever he is. A glorified deckhand. I just hope he has the good sense to keep his mouth shut about his career path. Commander Miller is a serious man. We can't have him thinking my son is some sort of low-level grunt." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I felt a hot surge of anger but swallowed it down, as I always did. Arguing with my father was like arguing with a brick wall. The wall never moved, and you just ended up with bruised knuckles. "I'm sure Reese will be on his best behavior," I mumbled, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. My anxiety grew with each passing day. It was a low hum beneath the surface of my skin, a constant reminder that we were all heading toward a collision. 2 days before the wedding, I got a text from Reese. It was the first I'd heard from him in nearly a month. "Landed, see you Saturday, don't worry." "Don't worry." It was his standard sign-off, the 2 words he used to try and soothe my frayed nerves ever since we were kids. But how could I not worry? I knew what he was walking into. He was walking into a room filled with people who had already judged and dismissed him, led by his own brother and father. I tried to focus on my role as a bridesmaid, on supporting Alara. She was a kind, intelligent woman, and I genuinely liked her. She seemed to be the only one who asked about Reese with genuine curiosity rather than disdain. "I'm so glad Reese could make it," she told me during the rehearsal dinner. Blaine and his father don't talk about him much. What's he really like?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "He's different from Blaine," I said carefully. "He's very principled, very loyal. He keeps to himself, but he's one of the strongest people I know." Ilara smiled warmly. My father is looking forward to meeting him. Dad has a soft spot for anyone in the service, no matter the rank. He says it takes a certain kind of person to sign up for that life. Her words were a small comfort, a tiny pinprick of light in my growing dread. Perhaps her father, Commander Miller, would be a buffer. Perhaps his presence would force my own father and Blaine to be civil. But as I watched my family that evening, my hope dwindled. Blaine was in his element, holding court, telling loud stories about his latest market victories. My father stood beside him, beaming, looking every bit the proud Pat. Rearch of a successful dynasty. When someone asked Blaine if his brother would be at the wedding, I saw that familiar, condescending smirk play on his lips. "Oh yes, the other brother is gracing us with his presence," Blaine said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "He managed to get some time off from guarding the doors, or whatever it is he does. We'll have to make sure he doesn't feel too out of place amongst all the grown-ups." A few of his friends chuckled. I felt my stomach clench. I looked across the room and saw Alara's smile tighten ever so slightly. She'd heard it too. She shot me a quick, almost apologetic glance. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Reese, alone in some anonymous hotel room, preparing to face the family that held him in such low esteem. I thought about the lie I was complicit in, the silence I had maintained for years. As an architect, I knew that a structure built on a faulty foundation, no matter how beautiful its facade, was doomed to collapse. Our family was that structure. And the wedding was the earthquake that was about to hit. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky so brilliantly blue and clear it felt like a mockery of the storm brewing in my heart. The venue was an old, sprawling estate with ivy-covered stone walls, vast gardens, and a grand ballroom that had been decorated to within an inch of its life. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, and every surface was covered in a sea of white roses and peonies. It was opulent, ostentatious, and so perfectly Blaine. I stood with the other bridesmaids in a sun-drenched antechamber, the fabric of my silky dress feeling slick and foreign against my skin. Through the large arched window, I could see guests arriving, men in sharp tuxedos and women in elegant, jewel-toned dresses. They were the titans of finance, law, and industry, the world my father and Blaine worshipped. My phone buzzed. It was Reese. At the front gate, "They're not letting me drive in, says it's valet only." My heart sank. Of course. Reese drove a 10-year-old unassuming pickup truck. It was practical, reliable, and paid for all qualities my father and Blaine failed to appreciate. It wouldn't fit in with the fleet of luxury cars lining the long, winding driveway. "I'm coming," I texted back, quickly making an excuse to Alara about needing a breath of fresh air. I hurried out of the ballroom, my heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. As I rounded the corner of the main house, I saw him. Reese was standing by the ornate iron gates, talking to a stern-looking security guard. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a simple, well-fitted dark gray suit, but it looked different on him than it did on Blaine's friends. Where their suits looked like costumes of power, Reese's looked like an afterthought, something worn out of necessity. What struck me was the way he stood. He was perfectly still, his posture relaxed but radiating an unnerving alertness. His eyes scanned everything, not with the casual glance of a guest, but with a methodical, assessing gaze. He had changed since I'd last seen him a year ago. He was leaner, and there were fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He carried himself with a quiet, profound weight, as if he were anchored to the ground by unseen forces. "Reese," I called out, breaking into a slight jog. His face broke into a rare, genuine smile when he saw me. "Lyra, you look amazing." "So do you," I said, giving him a tight hug. He felt solid as a rock. "What's the problem here?" "My truck isn't on the approved list of vehicles, apparently," he said with a wry, humorless chuckle. He suggested I park it down the road and walk. The security guard looked flustered when he saw me. "Sorry, miss, we just have instructions about the vehicles in the main drive." "He's the groom's brother," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "He's with me, let him through." After a moment's hesitation and a quick check of his clipboard, The guard relented. Reese gave me a grateful look as he got back into his truck and followed me up the driveway, parking his dusty but clean vehicle in a far corner of the lot, away from the gleaming rows of status symbols. When we walked into the main hall together, the reaction was immediate. Blaine, standing with a group of his groomsmen, saw us and his smile faltered for a second. He strode over, his own tuxedo tailored to perfection. "Reese, you made it," he said, his tone lacking any real warmth. He clapped Reese on the shoulder in a way that was more of a power play than a welcome. "Glad you could get away, keeping the doors of the nation safe." Reese's expression didn't change. Something like that. "Congratulations, Blaine." "Thanks," Blaine said, already turning his attention back to his friends. "Grab a drink. Try not to look so serious, it's a party." Then my father appeared, a glass of champagne in his hand. He gave Reese a cold, once over, his eyes lingering foe. A moment on the simple, unbranded watch on Reese's wrist. "Reese," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement, like noting a piece of furniture had been moved. He nodded curtly and then turned to me. "Lyra, Ilara needs you. The photographer is ready." He dismissed Reese without another word. I watched as my brother stood alone for a moment in the swirl of the crowd, an island of stillness in a sea of noise and laughter. He wasn't hurt, I knew him well enough to see that. He was observing, cataloging. It was a look I didn't understand, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I gave his arm a squeeze. "I have to go, will you be okay?" He looked at me, and for a fleeting second I saw a deep, bone-deep weariness in his eyes. "I'll be fine, Lyra," he said softly. "Just get through today, for Blaine." As I walked away, I looked back over my shoulder. Reese had found a spot near the back wall, away from the main thoroughfares of the room. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was just watching, his back straight, his presence a quiet, unnerving hum beneath the polished veneer of the celebration. He was there, but he was a world away. The ceremony was held in the estate's gardens, under a massive oak tree draped in white linen and flowers. It was beautiful, a picture-perfect scene from a magazine. Ilara was radiant, and even Blaine looked genuinely happy as he watched her walk down the aisle. As I stood there, holding my bouquet, my gaze drifted to the guests. My father was in the front row, his chest puffed out with pride. A few rows back, I spotted Reese. He sat at the end of a row, alone, a solemn figure amidst the sea of smiling faces. He looked like a storm cloud in an otherwise perfect sky. For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought we might actually make it through the day without incident. The vows were exchanged, the kiss was shared, and the crowd erupted in joyful applause. We moved from the sun-drenched garden to the grand ballroom for the reception, and the atmosphere shifted from solemn reverence to high-spirited celebration. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of hundreds of conversations, and the smooth sounds of a live jazz band filled the cavernous room. I circulated, fulfilling my bridesmaid duties, smiling until my cheeks ached. But I always kept Reese in my line of sight. He'd taken a seat at a table near the back, a table filled with distant cousins and a few of Ilara's colleagues who seemed unsure of how to approach him. He ate very little and spoke even less, simply nodding politely when spoken to. The dread that had been a low hum all day began to crescendo as the time for speeches arrived. Ilara's father, Commander David Miller, went first. He was an impressive man, tall and distinguished in his immaculate navy dress uniform, adorned with a colorful array of ribbons. He spoke with warmth and humor about his daughter and welcomed Blaine into their family with sincerity. He was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. Then it was Blaine's turn. He strode to the microphone, basking in the spotlight. He was a natural performer, charming and confident. He thanked his new in-laws, paid a glowing tribute to Ilara, and then turned his attention to our family. "I have to thank my parents, especially my father," Blaine said, raising his glass to Grant. "He taught me that with hard work and ambition you can build anything you want. He is the rock of this family, a true titan." My father beamed, his face flushed with pride. "And to my sister, Lyra," Blaine continued, giving me a nod. "The architect, She makes sure everything is built on a solid foundation. We love you. I offered a weak smile, my stomach twisting into a knot. I knew what was coming next. He was ticking off the family members, and there was only one left. Blaine's charming smile tightened into a smirk. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the back table where Reese sat. And of course, I have to give a shout-out to my little brother Reese. He managed to fly in for this. A polite, scattered applause rippled through the room. It's really great to see him in a suit, Blaine went on, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. We don't get to see him often. His job is very important. He paused for effect, letting the insinuation hang in the air. He's in the Navy, you know. He's basically a doorman on a big ship, checking IDs and making sure no one gets on who isn't supposed to. He looked around the room, inviting them in on the joke. So, I have to ask myself, he said, his voice rising, my brother's just a Navy doorman. Who would respect him? The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't just a few chuckles. It was a wave of loud, unrestrained amusement from Blaine's and my father's friends, people who understood status and money and saw a man like Reese as nothing more than a punchline. The sound was physically painful. It felt like a punch to my gut. My eyes shot to my father. He was laughing too, shaking his head. He leaned over to the man next to him, a wealthy developer, and I heard his voice, low but clear, carry across the table. He's the disgrace of this family, my father said, a note of finality in his tone as if stating an undeniable fact. A total waste of potential. I froze, time seemed to slow down. The laughter, the music, the clinking glasses, it all faded into a dull roar. All I could see was Reese. I expected to see him angry or hurt or shamed, but he wasn't. His face was a mask of absolute stillness. He sat perfectly upright, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't flinch. He just stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on nothing. It was the most terrifying emptiness I had ever seen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and yell at all of them to shatter their smug, comfortable world. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my voice trapped in my throat. I was the silent archway again, watching the structure crumble, paralyzed by years of practiced inaction. In that moment of humiliating, public mockery, I hated my brother, I hated my father, but most of all, I hated myself for my silence. The wave of laughter crested and then slowly subsided, leaving an awkward, self-conscious silence in its wake. Blaine, looking immensely pleased with himself, raised his glass for a final toast. The moment stretched, thick with the residue of cruelty. The guests shifted in their seats, some of them starting to realize that the joke had perhaps landed too hard, that the public shaming had crossed a line. Blaine seemed oblivious, his smirk firmly in place. It was into this tense quiet that a new sound emerged. It was the scrape of a chair leg against the polished wooden floor. Slowly, deliberately, Commander David Miller rose from his seat at the head table. Every eye in the room swiveled to him. He was in his full dress uniform, a man who radiated an aura of authority that was nothing like my father's blustering power. This was a quiet, profound command, honed by years of leadership in situations I couldn't begin to imagine. The room went utterly silent. Even the jazz band, about to start their next number, paused, their instruments held in midair. Commander Miller didn't look at Blaine. He didn't look at my father. His gaze was fixed, aimed like a laser across the ballroom, directly at the back table, directly at Reese. My brother, Reese, who had been a statue of impassive stone, finally moved. He looked up, his eyes meeting the commander's. I saw a flicker of something in his expression, not fear, but something like alarm or resignation. Commander Miller stood at his full height, his back ramrod straight. He brought his right hand up to his brow in a salute so sharp, so precise, that the crisp snap of his gloved fingers seemed to echo in the silent hall. It was not a gesture of polite recognition. It was a salute of profound, unequivocal respect. A salute from a commander to a subordinate he held in the highest regard. My father's smile froze on his face. Blaine's smug expression dissolved into a mask of pure confusion. Commander Miller held the salute for a long, pregnant moment. Then, his voice cut through the silence, clear and powerful, ringing with an authority that vibrated through the very floorboards. "I apologize for the interruption," he began, his voice devoid of apology. "But I cannot, in good conscience, allow a profound act of service to be misrepresented in this way." He lowered his hand but kept his eyes locked on Reese. "The man you see at the back of the room is not a doorman. He doesn't just check IDs." The commander took a breath, and the entire room seemed to lean in. "This is Petty Officer First Class Reese," he announced, his voice booming with pride. "He is a combat medic attached to the United States Naval Special Warfare Command. You may know them by their other name, the Navy SEALs." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a soft, sibilant sound, like the wind being knocked out of 200 people at once. SEAL, the word hung in the air, electric and unbelievable. Commander Miller wasn't finished. "This man," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "has deployed 6 times to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The ribbons on my chest," he gestured to his own uniform, "pale in comparison to the commendations he is not authorized to wear in public. He has saved more lives, demonstrated more courage, and sacrificed more for his country than anyone in this room will ever know." He finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over Blaine and then settling, with immense, cold weight, on my father. "He is not a disgrace to his family," the commander stated, his voice like flint. "He is a national hero, and he deserves your respect." The world tilted on its axis. I stared at my father, Grant. The ruddy, proud color had drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sh. Ian, his mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with a horror-struck disbelief. He was completely, utterly frozen, a statue of his own shattered arrogance. I tore my eyes from my father and looked at Blaine. My brother, the golden child, the master of his universe, looked like he had been slapped. He was pale, his eyes darting from Commander Miller to Reese, his mind clearly unable to process what was happening. His wedding, his perfect day, his moment of triumph, had just been spectacularly derailed. Then I looked at Reese, my quiet, stoic brother. The weight of the commander's words, the sudden, violent stripping away of his carefully guarded anonymity, the full, crushing force of public recognition, it all hit him at once. For the first time in his life, his mask of stone finally cracked. His face went ashen. His body, which had been so rigidly controlled, seemed to lose all its tension. He swayed slightly in his chair. His eyes, wide with shock, rolled back in his head. And then, with a quiet sigh, he collapsed, sliding sideways from his chair and onto the floor in a heap. My brother, the Navy SEAL, the hero, had fainted. The sight of Reese collapsing shattered the spell of shocked silence. A woman screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor as people half rose from their seats, craning their necks to see. The elegant ballroom dissolved into a scene of chaos and confusion. Before anyone else could react, Commander Miller was in motion. He crossed the ballroom in a few long, purposeful strides, his face a mask of grim concern. He knelt beside Reese, his movements efficient and practiced. "Give him space," he commanded, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Someone call for the venue's medical staff now." I finally broke free from my own paralysis. "Reese!" The name was torn from my throat as I shoved my way through the gawking guests, my bridesmaid dress tangling around my ankles. I fell to my knees on the other side of him, my hands hovering uselessly over his still form. "He's breathing, his pulse is steady," the commander said, his fingers pressed against Reese's neck. He looked at me, his eyes softening with a hint of pity. "He's just unconscious. It's likely exhaustion, physical and emotional." Ilara, the bride, was right behind me, her beautiful white dress pooling on the floor. Her face was a canvas of horror and disbelief. She wasn't looking at Reese. She was staring at her new husband, Blaine, who stood pale and dumbfounded near the head table. "Blaine, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. My father, Grant, finally unfroze. He pushed himself to his feet, stumbling slightly. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 2 minutes. "A SEAL," he kept muttering to himself, his voice raspy. "A Navy SEAL." He looked at Reese on the floor, not with concern, but with a dazed, uncomprehending stare, as if looking at a stranger who had inexplicably appeared in his life. The venue's paramedics arrived, pushing a gurney. They were professional and quick, checking Reese's vitals and speaking in low, calm tones. As they began to load him onto the gurney, Reese's eyelids fluttered open. He blinked, his eyes unfocused as he took in the circle of faces staring down at him. Paramedics, Commander Miller, me, Alara. Then his memory seemed to return, and a look of profound mortification washed over his face. "No," he groaned, trying to sit up. "I'm fine, just need a minute." "Easy, son," Commander Miller said, placing a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. "Just let them check you out. Everything's all right." "No, it's not," Reese whispered, his eyes finding mine. The look in them was a mixture of shame and a desperate plea for escape. He had built his life around anonymity, around being the gray man who blended into the background. Being the center of attention, especially like this, was his worst nightmare. "We need to get him out of here," I said to the commander, my voice shaking. "Away from all these people." He nodded in agreement. "We'll take him to the private suite upstairs." As the paramedics wheeled the gurney towards the exit, a path cleared through the stunned guests. They stared at Reese with a new, awestruck curiosity. They were no longer looking at a punchline, they were looking at a hero. The whispers followed us, a tide of speculation and gossip. "Did you hear? A seal? I can't believe it. His own brother said that." I walked beside the gurney, my hand resting on Reese's arm. I didn't care about the wedding anymore. I didn't care about the guests or the spectacle. All I cared about was the brother I had failed to defend. We entered a small, quiet library off the main hall, a world away from the disaster unfolding in the ballroom. The paramedics finished their checks, confirmed it was likely a vasovagal syncope episode, a simple faint brought on by extreme stress, and after Reese insisted he was fine, they left us. It was just the four of us in the room, me. A pale and shaken Reese sitting on the edge of a velvet couch, a grim-faced Commander Miller standing by the door, and Alara, who had followed us in, her eyes filled with tears of anger and embarrassment for her husband's behavior. The silence was heavy. Reese stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "I'm sorry, sir," Reese said finally, his voice hoarse. He was speaking to the commander. "I'm sorry for causing a scene." Commander Miller shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for, petty officer. I am the one who's sorry. I put you in the spotlight. But I could not stand by and listen to that disrespect. Men like you are the backbone of the freedom they take for granted. They had to know." Just then, the door to the library swung open. My father and Blaine stood in the doorway. Blaine looked utterly lost, his face white as a sheet. My father had regained some of his composure, but his eyes were filled with a frantic, desperate energy. "Is it true?" Grant demanded, his voice cracking. He was looking at Commander Miller, not at his own son. "Everything you said, he's really a SEAL." The commander's gaze was glacial. "I do not lie about the service records of my men." My father staggered into the room, his eyes finally landing on Reese. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a bewildering mix of emotions. "Why?" he choked out. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question, so full of wounded pride and willful ignorance, was the final straw. The dam of my silence, which had been cracking for years, finally burst. Reese didn't answer my father's question. He just continued to stare at the floor, as if the pattern on the expensive rug held the secrets to the universe. He looked exhausted, not just from the fainting spell, but from a decade of carrying a weight none of us could comprehend. "Why didn't he tell you?" I heard myself say, my voice trembling with a fury that felt foreign and yet utterly right. Both my father and Blaine turned to look at me surprised. I was the quiet one, the mediator. I never raised my voice. "Why would he, Dad?" I took a step forward, feeling a strange, liberating power surge through me. "When would he have told you? At one of those family dinners where you couldn't stop talking about Blaine's portfolio? Or during one of the phone calls where you sighed every time Reese couldn't talk about his menial job?" I turned my glare on Blaine, who flinched as if I'd physically struck him. And you, the Navy doorman, did you ever once, for a single second, stop to think that maybe he was quiet because his job was serious? That he was secretive because he was protecting things you can't even imagine? No, it was easier to make him a joke. It made you feel bigger, didn't it? Lyra, this is not the time, my father started, trying to reclaim control. This is exactly the time, I shot back, my voice rising. You created this. You built a family where worth is measured in dollars and job titles. Reese didn't fit into your narrow little definition of success, so you wrote him off. You called him a disgrace. The raw truth of the words hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Ilara, standing near the window, wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes fixed on her new husband with a look of profound disappointment. It was then that Reese finally looked up. The weariness was still there, but it was overlaid with a new, quiet resolve. He rose slowly to his feet, his posture once again ramrod straight. He looked at our father. "You want to know why I never told you?" he asked, his voice low and steady but carrying more power than any of my shouting. "Because you never asked. Not really. You didn't want to know about me. You wanted to know if I was making you look good. You wanted to know if my career was something you could boast about at the country club." He shook his head, a small, sad movement. "My world, the things I've seen, the men I serve with, it's not about boasting. It's about sacrifice. It's about protecting the guy next to you. It's about a purpose bigger than a bank account. And I knew," his voice cracked for just a moment, "I knew you wouldn't understand that. You would have tried to turn it into a status symbol, another trophy for your collection. And it's not a trophy. It's my life, and it's the lives of my brothers." My father stood there, speechless. For the first time in my life, I saw him completely and utterly defeated, with no retort, no blustering defense. The foundation of his world had been based on the idea that his values were the only ones that mattered. Commander Miller's words, and now Reese's, had taken a sledgehammer to that foundation. Blaine finally found his voice, a desperate, pathetic squeak. "Reese, I didn't know. I thought it was just a joke. I'm sorry." "A joke," Reese said, his eyes now like ice. "You stood up at your own wedding, in front of hundreds of people, and you humiliated me to get a laugh. You've been doing it, my WH. Ole life, Blaine. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was just the loudest you've ever been about it." He took a step towards the door, his movements sure and final. He paused beside me and put a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you, Lyra." Then he turned to face our father and brother one last time. "I'm done," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I'm done trying to earn a place at a table where I was never wanted. I'm done being your disappointment. I wish you a happy life, Blaine." He gave a respectful nod to Commander Miller and Ilara. "Commander, ma'am." And with that, he walked out of the room. I didn't hesitate. I looked at the wreckage of my family, my stunned father, my weeping sister-in-law, my pathetic, broken brother, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of release. I turned and followed Reese, walking out of the library, through the now hushed and whispering reception hall, and out into the cool evening air. We didn't say anything as we walked across the parking lot to his old pickup truck. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The sounds of the disastrous party faded behind us. When we reached his truck, Reese leaned against the door and finally let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at me, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "Well," he said, "that's a wedding they won't forget." I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but for the first time, it wasn't a tear of sadness or frustration. It was a tear of relief. "Where will you go?" I asked. "I have to report back in a few days," he said. "Until then, I'll just drive, find somewhere quiet." He looked at me, his eyes full of a warmth I hadn't seen in years. "Come with me, Lyra, just for a little while." I didn't need to think. I nodded, a real smile finally breaking through. "Okay." As I got into the passenger seat of his unassuming truck, leaving the gleaming luxury cars and the shattered facade of my family behind, I felt like I was breathing freely for the first time in my life. The archway had finally chosen a side. The structure had collapsed, but in its place, something new and stronger was already being built. a foundation of truth and loyalty, shared between a brother and a sister, on the road to somewhere quiet. So I have to ask you, was I wrong to stand by and say nothing for so long? What would you have done in my shoes?